Well, good morning, everyone. I see we got a capacity crowd. I don't know if we need to put chairs outside, but this morning's session is on top things you wanted to know about public finance but were afraid to ask, or in other words, we call it Debt 101. So if you were intending to be in a different session, now's your opportunity to say you just wanted to see something and then leave. Quick poll before we get started. How many of you have issued municipal bonds in your jurisdiction? So roughly about 2/3 of you. How many of you even know what type of issues your jurisdiction does? What type of debt issues? Oh, good. Roughly half. How many of you already know basically the process for issuing debt? Well, good. So we may have to step it up, Debt 102 then. By way of a quick introduction, I'm here on behalf of GFOA. GFOA invited me to do this presentation. We have nearly 19,000 member organizations with and they're across the states, all 50 states. Our members perform financial functions at the state, local, school district, special district, authorities, any kind of political subdivision there are. That's where our members work and perform financial functions. About 3/4 of our members are smaller to mid-sized governments. As a professional organization of public finance officers, we work closely with our sister organizations, and our sister organizations represent cities, counties, treasurers, governors, state legislatures on bond market and infrastructure assets. So our agenda for today, we would like to answer certain questions about public debt. For instance, why municipal bonds? When we approve debt, what exactly are we approving? Why should I care? Who is on the financing team? Why do we need a lawyer? What does structuring mean? Do we have to go to market? How do bonds get sold? And then after you've issued, what comes next? And what are our continuing responsibilities? Government entities have been issuing debt for over 200 years. I'm sure you remember reading the stories of Civil War and even wars before then, how governments had to raise money. Long time ago, it used to be a few rich investors would help finance a war effort or some other major government project. If you go way back, I wondered how, like, ancient Rome and others financed large public infrastructure projects. But, a lot of those, their form of government was an emperor or a dictator, so he just taxed the people. They did have what they call a form of borrowing from the public, but the more I read about it, it was more like extortion than borrowing, because I don't think the government ever paid them back. So what are municipal bonds? Municipal bonds are debt securities issued by states, cities, counties, and other governmental entities to fund day-to-day obligations and to finance capital projects such as building schools, highways, or sewer systems. Generally, the interest on municipal bonds is exempt from federal income tax. And there's advantages to the investor as well for buying municipal bonds. So, the tax exempt, like we just mentioned, municipal bonds usually are more high quality, less volatile, so they add diversification to your portfolio. So if you've got long on equities, you may want to diversify with municipal bonds because they offer a different set of risks and a nice complement. So municipal bonds are good for the issuer and they're good for the investor as well. When we approve debt, what exactly are we approving? You're giving your team the ability to receive an infusion of cash to build a project. In return, the government repays the bond purchaser over time, plus interest. Complete a capital project with a repayment schedule that spreads the cost of the project over its useful life, and the bond purchaser receives a reasonably reliable source of investment income, as we just noted. You will hear about these projects and the capital sources used to fund it through the capital planning process. I think the slide skipped, it skipped a few slides. I wanted to touch on what are the risks of governmental debt generally. There's a risk that if you don't continue to disclose according to what you've agreed to disclose by law and within the debt covenants, you could find yourself facing lawsuits, fines, etc. And then we all know about the political risk of increasing leverage. You know, as you issue debt, I mean, you get all these wonderful things, and people tend to forget about the increasing debt service. And you wake up one day, and now you find that your budget you can do less with because you got, you know, a third of your operating budget has to go to debt service. So, and then that's what the public focuses on a lot of time when it comes to debt. I mean, they love the projects, but then the debt is something that at least political opponents can harp on. And then there's a long-standing argument about intergenerational equity. The fact that we're forcing future generations to pay for our consumption. So if the purposes and the reasons you issue debt are not well chosen, then in fact that's what you could be doing. That's why a lot of municipalities and governments do not use debt, at least long-term debt, to finance current operations. Because to do so, I mean, you're burdening future generations for the consumption, the ongoing operation of the current generation. And that's considered, you know, immoral and it's not fair. All right, I'm gonna get this right. So why should I care? Before, you know I want this project. I know we're gonna have to borrow money. But should I care before that time? Should I care before we've got the money and we're building the project? And the answer is yes. Appropriate planning and understanding helps to provide the most favorable results to the issuer and also helps avoid unnecessary risks and negative consequences. Debt issuance requires working with a number of partners, each of whom has a specific role. The debt issuance will result in a financing agreement that is legally binding, and it is critically important that the government officials understand the basic terms of the agreement and what the agreement commits them to. In other words, if you start paying attention after the debt issued, you may be locked into something that you regret. I mean, that's happened, in Birmingham, Alabama, and some other municipalities where probably by the time the elected officials realized what the finance people were doing, it was too late. You'd already locked yourself either into debt that was issued with derivative instruments, where they sold options on, or, I mean, the terms of the structuring of the debt was grossly unfavorable to the government. So it's important that you be involved not just once the debt is issued and the buildings are being built, but also understand what's occurring in the planning process. How are we going about structuring the debt? So who is on the financing team? When you're going to issue debt, who do you assemble to be on the financing team? Well, you have bond counsel, and the bond counsel works directly with the issuer. Bond counsel is usually an attorney or a group of attorneys with specialized experience in municipal financings. And you expect bond counsel to issue normally two general opinions. The first opinion you want them to issue is whether the financing that you're proposing is valid. That is legal. And whether it's binding, it's a binding obligation of the issuer. So that, you have laws on the books as municipalities, and there's certain things that have to occur in order for the municipality, for it to be valid debt of the municipality or of the governmental entity. And the second opinion you want bond counsel to do is to determine the taxability of the debt issue. I mean, if you intended to have a tax-exempt issue, you have to structure the debt, and the purpose for which you're structuring the debt must be a tax-exempt purpose. And you need bond counsel to opine on this. Another member of the finance team is the municipal advisor or financial advisor. That's a professional consultant who works directly with the issuer. Under the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, a municipal advisor working for a municipality must be registered with the SEC and must give fiduciary care in advising the issuer by putting the issuer's interests above their own financial interests in a transaction. I'll talk a little bit about underwriting, and I'll go back to explain why it was important to make that distinction. So the underwriter's role in this is the key conduit between the issuer and the ultimate investor. In a financing, they are ultimately working for the investor. So the underwriter is working for the investor primarily. The municipal advisor should be working for you. The underwriter, via the bond sale, agrees to buy the bonds and resell them to investors. Their role varies by the type of sale the issuer chooses. A competitive sale, we'll talk a little bit about these later, versus a negotiated, as described under the issuing process, as we'll talk about that later. One of the things that was important about the Dodd-Frank Act is that you had some players on the team that tended to bridge the line between what their role was and working on the finance team. You know, the municipal advisors, the underwriters, because the underwriters and the investment bankers have a lot of expertise, obviously, on the debt markets. And so you tend to, when you engage one of those, especially in a negotiated sale, they start to give you advice. Well, we think you should do this, we think you should do that. But if you're going to perform the role of an underwriter, you should be an underwriter, because, as we just said, the underwriter's interest is the investors, not necessarily you as the issuer. And so if you're getting your advice from the underwriter, you're not necessarily getting advice that's in your best interest. I'm not saying all underwriters don't care about what happens to you, but their primary interest is the investor. So Dodd-Frank wanted clear that the municipal advisor's role is to work in the best interest of the issuer, not their own best interest, not the best interest of a third party, but in the issuer's best interest. And these advisors have to be registered with the SEC, so they just can't, publish themselves as advisors, and they're really not. So they have to register with the SEC, which did create some gray areas because, you have some people that may be on certain boards and commissions that may have a certain level of expertise, and as part of their role on the board and commissions may give advice or say, I recommend, but they're really not intended to perform in the role of a municipal advisor. They're really just, they feel that as their role on the commission, or that's their role on the board. But they have to be careful, because if they start, walking like a duck and quacking like a duck, then maybe they should have registered with the SEC. So that created a little concern. I mean, GFOA was on the foremost in comment on that, making sure that the rules were clear so that innocent people didn't get swept up in a violation that they didn't intend to violate. Then you have some other participants on the finance team, like the paying agent or trustee, and their role is they make sure they make all the debt service payments, and they distribute it, so you pay them, and then they pay the investors. The trustee also could be used to hold a reserve, like if the particular debt issue you have requires a certain reserve, then the trustee often is contracted to hold that reserve. And they have other funds that depend on the issuing documents that they are responsible for. Then you have the rating agencies. The rating agency, you guys probably all heard of them. They're responsible for rating the quality of your debt and what is the repayment risk, because investors are concerned about repayment risk. Luckily, with municipal bonds, the repayment risk is low, although we've seen some high-profile failures recently. But that's normally not the case. And then you have bond insurance and other credit enhancers. So if you feel that your rating, or maybe the rating doesn't give you the quality that you may want for market. I mean, it doesn't mean necessarily you got a bad rating, it just means that the way you want to sell your bonds may not be as high as you want. Well, you can contract with an insurance provider and you can enhance. So essentially the insurance provider's credit rating substitutes for yours, because they'll make good if you default. So back to the role of bond counsel. In order to issue debt, issuers must comply with local, state, and federal laws and enter into a number of legal agreements with various parties. Let me back up for a second. I'm sorry, I went right into talking about the subject matter, and I didn't do an introduction. And Mike had asked me before, do you need the moderator to do the introduction? I said, no, I could do an introduction, but I was so focused on the topic, I didn't introduce myself. So my name is Lenny Moore. I currently work for Montgomery County Government, Maryland. I'm the controller there. Prior to working for Montgomery County Government, which I've been there for 8 years, but Montgomery County Government, of course, is a AAA-rated government, one of the largest in the country. It's got, to me, it was unusual because the budget there is $5 billion, and we have about 1 million people. And I used to work for Cook County, with over 5 million people, and our budget was about the same, $5 billion. But it's sort of deceptive because we had a $5 billion budget, but we didn't fund the school systems. In Illinois, the school districts are separate. So in Montgomery County, the whole county is the school district, so you fund the school system. But anyway, prior to going to Montgomery County, I was consultant with RTA, and we advised certain foreign governments. I found myself in Iraq advising them on setting up a new public finance system. And it was interesting because there we worked with a lot of international experts. And, I didn't know until I went to Iraq, call me naive, that a lot of governments, including France, you don't have budgets at the local level the way we do here, where you have a certain level of independence. You have a central government that has a budget, and then you put in your request, if you're a local entity, you put in your request to this overall central budget for the nation. And it was a completely foreign concept to me, but it was a lot of the international experts that was there, that's what they were comfortable with. And so when we were advising the government in Iraq on how to set up their finance system, of course, we were thinking American style, and that's sort of our direction we got from the State Department. And the international experts were sort of thinking along the lines of what they're seeing elsewhere. And it's also what the Iraqis were used to, because, under Saddam Hussein, everything was controlled by the central government. And we were trying to create something like what we have here in the U.S., where you have the provincial governments with a certain level of autonomy, and then the federal government having certain others. So it was an interesting experience, and it really taught you a lot about contrasting financial styles, financial system styles. So anyway, that's by way of introduction, and I'm sorry about that. I should have done that at the beginning. So back to why we need a lawyer. Local and state laws will vary. So you may have general rules that you follow with your federal laws, but then your local and state laws will vary, and it's critical that issuers consult with specialized legal counsel to determine if they are authorized to issue debt, what actions are required to authorize issuance, and any constraints placed on debt issuance. For instance, your state may have limits on the amount of debt that you could issue, and for what reasons you can issue the debt. The use of the finance facility will impact the project's eligibility for federal tax exemption and the associated reduced borrowing costs to the issuer. Legal counsel should advise the issuer on tax implications related to private use and tax-exempt status affecting the debt obligation. These requirements could have significant impact on interest rates, repayment, and continuing disclosure for the debt instrument selected. So, how many of you heard of public-private partnerships? So a lot of these, you engage in them primarily so you think you can use the resources and expertise of the private partner, and a lot of times that work. But in some instances, the government is expected to issue the debt to finance whatever this public-private partnership is. So you really need bond counsel to get in there and examine it, because depending on the nature of the public-private partnership, because obviously the private part of the partnership stands to benefit, stands to profit, and it may lose its tax-exempt purpose. And so you need your bond counsel in to say, hey, well, look, this debt really should be taxable debt, or there may be a way you can structure it such that part of it is tax-exempt and part of it's not. It may get more complicated there, but those are the type of things that bond counsel gets involved in. Even in things that you may not think are private partnerships. For instance, if you're going to build your government headquarters and you say, well, look, we can help pay for part of our government headquarters by leasing out space to different vendors. I'm going to have cafeteria, and I'll bring in this company, and they'll charge them lease space and get a certain percentage of their profits, and they'll have a cafeteria, and I'll have another store over here. Well, that can start to be a private purpose, and that may not be eligible for tax exempt. So you need a bond counsel to get in there and talk about that. What does structuring mean? Issuers looking to utilize debt financing should review and update annual capital improvement plans to identify projects that can be funded with annual operating funds, in addition to those that might be candidates for debt financing. Projects should be thoroughly reviewed as to scope, feasibility, cost, useful life of the financed asset, and capacity to repay debt. All of these factors will help determine whether long-term financing is an appropriate tool, and if so, what revenues are appropriate to pledge for repayment and what the term of repayment should be. There's a lot of projects that cost a lot of money that you may be tempted to fund with debt, but probably should be funded out of operating funds. I was somewhere where they needed to do a large purchase of vests for their police department. And individually, the vests, $1,000 or whatever vests cost, but collectively for what they were to purchase, it was quite a sum, and they were like, well, let's issue debt. Well, that's not necessarily appropriate for debt. What's the useful life of these vests? How long are they expected? Do you really want a 20-year term debt issue for the vest that expected to last, 5 years? Maybe there's some other financial arrangement, or if you hopefully got enough operating money to pay for it. But those are the considerations that we're just talking about. Sufficient revenue should be available to meet ongoing debt repayments, and jurisdiction needs to understand what type of revenues are pledged to support or secure the debt. Potential revenues may include a full or limited taxing power of the jurisdiction, utility revenues, or other specific revenue streams or collateral, such as an asset that is being acquired with the debt proceeds. A lot of people like pledge revenues because pledge revenues a lot of times do not go against your debt limit because they're not pledging the full faith and credit of the government. All you're doing is pledging that specific revenue source. And so it tends to be attractive, but the downside of it is pledge revenues sometimes are more expensive to issue because investors know it's not backed by the full faith and credit of the government. And so a lot of times they got what they call coverage ratios. So a lot of times they want to know that the revenue that you're getting in exceeds your particular debt service by a certain amount before they're even interested in pledge revenues. So various types of debt are typically available to issuers. Financing tools may include municipal bonds, which we've been talking about, both the taxable and the tax exempt, direct loans from financial institutions, and other less common alternatives. Each option has its own benefits and risks, and the issuer should utilize a municipal advisor to assist with determining which selection best suits a specific circumstance. How many of you got caught up remember there was a practice a while back of selling your government building and leasing it back?
Swaps.
Well, swaps, but also, go ahead.
Well, I didn't know if that's what you were referencing.
Oh, well, this is where you own a government building outright. It's your building.
Okay.
And then you find some real estate company that's in the real estate, and you sell them your building, and you lease it back. It's a form of financing because but the thing is you get this immediate cash infusion, because you sell your government building, they pay you back, and then you have to pay the lease payments over time. So a lot of governments got caught up into that because they had all these real estate assets that on the book that they've owned for 100 years that suddenly became very valuable. They're in key locations, so all of a sudden they can raise a ton of money by selling these assets, and they've got this huge cash infusion now. And then when you lease, of course, since they're the owner now, the real estate company's the owner, they're responsible for the maintenance and all this other stuff. And so they thought, hey, this is a win-win. We get this huge cash infusion, and someone else is responsible for maintaining these buildings. But you have to be careful. It's just a form of financing just like any other form of financing. You have to make sure that at the end of the day, it's a net positive cash flow for you. And not just look at the immediate advantages. The immediate advantages of a ton of money, But you have that's just another form of financing, and there's all kind of creative ways that our friends in the investor community have come to us to give us money. but they have to be evaluated. Bank loans, we talked about, that is another form, and they provide a lot of flexibility, sort of like when you go out and take a loan. A bank loan may carry a fixed or variable interest rate, in which interest may be paid in equal payments over a fixed period of time, or there may be interest only with a balloon payment at maturity. In addition, bank loans can be structured as a revolving line of credit. This means the borrower can draw on the funds up to the loan amount, pay some or all of the loan back, and then withdraw funds all during the term of the loan. This means the borrower can draw on the funds up to, typically bank loans are for a shorter duration than traditional bond sales and are usually in the 5 to 10 year duration. So normally you don't get a bank loan for 20, 30 years. You do have some banks that may be willing to go out 20 years. The legal work is a lot easier than doing a municipal bond, so that's what's attractive about it. How many have heard of bank qualified? Oh, good. So that's what makes it really easy, because it's interest in is tax exempt, that you pay on is tax exempt for the bank. The paperwork is really streamlined. The larger issuers normally don't qualify for bank. If you're a large issuer of debt, then more than likely you can't do a bank qualified issue. But if you can do a bank qualified issue, it's a lot of advantage to it. A lot less costly, a lot less involved to do a loan from a bank. There's one that's not really mentioned here, and they said it's tricky, especially for telling elected officials about it, but there's what they call interfund borrowing. And that's if you're in a position where let's say you have a particular fund that has a dedicated revenue stream, and if your law allows, a lot of this is tricky about the laws, but you set it up with a dedicated revenue stream, and the fund's got gobs of money, more money than you can find projects to do with it. So then, how can you use the money sitting there drawn, basically no interest, because you got restrictions on where you can invest it. So you say to yourself, I can borrow from an outside party and have to pay 5% interest. I'm just making this up. Or I could borrow from this fund and pay 5%. At least I'd be paying myself. I'd be enhancing the government's wealth. And so that's another option, but it's tricky. You have to make sure your law allows it. And you have to, it's easy if you borrow from yourself to rip yourself off. So, you borrow from another fund and you change the terms and you end up never paying it back. So that's tricky. Yes, question? It's called interfund borrowing, where you're borrowing between the funds. So you have, like I said, you have a fund or something like that has dedicated revenue, so it's getting the gobs of money and you don't really need to use it right away, so you borrow from it, you set up a loan agreement, but it's something that you have to get your local county attorney something to advise, make sure you're not violating the terms by which the fund was set up. But it is an option, because you're paying yourself instead of paying an outside investor. So how do I get the bonds sold? What's the process? Most local governments do not have the in-house expertise or resources to find investors for their proposed bond offerings, and will require the services of a specialized municipal securities dealer, underwriter, or syndicate of underwriters to sell the bonds for them. The decision of how to market municipal bonds should be based on the characteristics of the issuer, the bond issue, and the financial market. Governmental entities usually issue bonds through competitive bid or a negotiated sale. The primary goal of an issuer undertaking a bond issue should be the proper administration of the bond issue at the least possible issuance cost and interest rate. Both methods are used frequently in bringing municipal bonds to market. The overriding concern of many issuers is the minimization of interest rates and issuance costs. However, there currently are varying opinions regarding which type of sale results in the best outcome. Competitive bidding is most appropriate when the issuer is well known. High demand for the bonds is predicted and the market is stable. A negotiated sale can more appropriate when the issuer is less known. The market instrument is complex and less well understood by investors, and or the market is less stable. In a competitive bid process, the issuer conducts all of the tasks necessary to offer bonds for sale, including structuring the maturity schedule, preparing the official statement, verifying legal documents, obtaining a bond rating, securing credit enhancements, if you determine you want credit enhancements, and timing the sale. These tasks are normally done with the assistance of outside consultants, including a financial advisor and bond counsel, as we talked about earlier. Once the issue is structured, the public sale begins with the publication of an official notice of sale that describes the size, the maturities, purpose, and structure of the proposed issue, along with instruction for submitting bids. Underwriters submit closed bids to the issuer on the day and time designated in the official notice of sale. The bonds are awarded to the underwriter that has submitted the best price, otherwise known as the true interest cost. Once the bid is awarded, pricing and major structural aspects of the bonds are locked in regardless of the success or failure of the underwriter to sell the bonds to the investors. So once the underwriter bids on, you go out, you publicize that you have this debt issue that you want to issue, and it has the terms of your official statement that describes your government, your finances, what you want to do with the money, the terms of the debt issue, what your coupon rate is. That means what the interest you are marketing the debt at. And then once you get a successful underwriter, then it's locked in. The underwriter, whether that underwriter can resell that debt or not, that's his risk now, or her risk, or the firm's risk. But you've got your money, so now it's your problem. Question?
We're talking about the difference between competitive and negotiated firms.
Okay.
What about size? Does that factor into whether it should be competitive or negotiated?
Yeah, I forgot they told me. These sessions are being recorded, and they told me at the beginning to remember to repeat
Okay.
the questions, and I haven't been repeating the questions. So
I'll
Go
state
ahead,
it again, if that's okay. You were talking about the difference between competitive and negotiated sales, bond sales, and the differences in preference. How much does size of the transaction factor into whether or not it should be competitive or negotiated? Even if you're a well-known issuer, or even if you're a not so well-known issuer, but it's a significant size, say, does that suggest that it should be a negotiated or competitive sale too?
Well, it really, when size by itself will not determine really if you should do competitive or negotiated. It's really the complexity. And I'll tell you why size by itself. Because if I'm an underwriter, let's say under the competitive process. So I go out to market, I said, I'm a large government, a large issuer, and I need a lot of money. And I go out to market. Remember, I'm going to publish in advance that this is what I'm looking for. So if I'm an underwriter and I feel like, boy, that's too big for me to handle by myself, I'll go out and form a syndicate and then bid on it. So I'll do a competitive bid. Same thing on negotiated. If I'm an underwriter and I'm working with you on a negotiated issue, then if I feel that this is getting too large for me to handle by myself, I go out and form a syndicate with other underwriters, and then we will handle the deal. So the size itself doesn't matter. It really gets to, like we say, it's the complexity of it, or how well known of an issue you are. Because depending on how complex it is, you go out, you publish it out, and underwriters don't really understand it, you're not going to get good results because they just don't understand the deal. So in that terms, you may want to just work with an underwriter on the deal. Or if they don't know who you are, like you're a new entity, newly formed, they don't understand your risks, they don't understand if you even be around in the next 10 years, then you may want to deal with an underwriter that can spend a little more time with you instead of just reading something, in a publish. But size a lot of times, though, does mean complexity, right? So, but still, we have, if you go on GFOA's website, we have best practices, and we recommend that in most cases, competitive process is better. But there's a lot of instances which you should do negotiated. Yes, question.
I have a two-part question. First, were there not some new federal regulations that came down involving FAs and their relationships that they have with the supervisors or county commissioners or city commissioners where they can't get involved in the political process. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, and we touched on that a little bit earlier.
I'm sorry, I came in late.
No, that's fine. We touched on it a little earlier, but you're exactly right. It's part of the Dodd-Frank Act. And what they were trying to do is exactly what they were trying to, if you were a financial advisor, a municipal advisor, they wanted it clear that's what the role you were playing. And not only is that the role you're playing, you're supposed to put the issuer's interest above your own. So they wanted it clear that you weren't there advising them, and you're advising them, but really behind the scenes, you've got an investor lined up that has a certain interest, so you're really negotiating on behalf of the investor. The other thing that got caught up in this was sort of what you alluded to, which is you have, like I was saying earlier, you have a lot of experts that in your community, and because they are experts, have decided to volunteer to work on commissions, boards. Like our pension fund has an outside expert that he's just volunteer. I mean, it's not he didn't volunteer because he was getting paid. But the thing about it is because they are an expert in certain fields, they may want to give advice, because they got an interest. They're there sitting there every day. They're listening to this. Hey, I think we should do this. And I think it should be structured like this. Well, the unintended consequence of the law was that these people may or may not have to register with the SEC as a financial advisor. And that created a lot of consternation because people were like, well, we don't want to exclude all expertise from our boards and commissions, because they're scared that they're going to get caught up under this law and have to go register with the SEC. So the SEC and others have been trying to do a good job of clarifying, exactly what is a financial advisor, a municipal advisor. And GFA did a lot in trying to promote that clarification so that you don't have these unintended consequences. Because really, the law was really intended just to make sure that if you have someone that's working for you as a financial advisor, that's exactly what they're doing, giving you the best advice for your situation and not having some alternative interests involved.
Second part of that question, we have some underwriters that have mentioned to us, there's fees involved with every aspect of somebody that's involved in these financial transactions.
Right.
But there are some underwriters that have, and even some bond counsel that have said, look, you don't need an FA involved in this process. What is your thoughts on that?
Well, it depends on how simplistic the issue is. If you're talking about a negotiated sale, and it's a very straightforward, then maybe you don't want an FA. But again,
And these are negotiated.
right. Again, what we said earlier is that the interest of the underwriter is the investors. So you have to be sure when you're working with an underwriter, because they have certain level of expertise and they're giving you suggestions and they're explaining certain things, you might get tended to believe that, oh, they're helping me out a lot. I'm just going to trust everything these guys tell me because they're really providing me a lot of good information. But you have to remember, just from the nature of their business, their interest is the investor. Their primary interest is the investor. So everything they tell you may not be necessarily in your best interest. It is in someone's best interest, but it may not be in your best interest. And it's not that they're being dishonest and trying to, but it's just where where the bread is buttered.
So it sounds, I just want to make sure too.
It sounds like you're saying, no, you want an FA in a negotiated transaction because if the underwriter is representing the investor's interests and you've got a transaction, a complex structure, then you need an FA that can help represent your interests in understanding that structure, because the FA is your advisor and the underwriter is essentially representing the investors.
That's correct.
So you were saying you should get FA. That's a question.
Well, no, complex. It depends on the level of expertise of your in-house staff. It depends on the nature of the debt issue that you're doing. And in most cases, you probably want an FA because most people, it's just not cost effective for them to have on board that level of expertise ongoing. So even if you hire an outside expert, you bring them on as your employee. The problem is that they have to keep current on the market. A lot of times you become an employee, you get drowned with employee stuff, and your government can't afford to send them all these expensive conferences that teach them what's going on latest in the, because those financial market conferences can get very expensive. I used to work for what used to be called the General Accounting Office, now it's called the Government Accountability Office, And we had, one of the things Congress wanted to do was look at, this is when derivatives were becoming big for the first time, and they also were called innovative financial instruments. Well, one of the things as part of we had to look at the risk that's posed, how they managed the risk, what were their purposes, various things about them. Well, one of the things that we had to do as part of that job was attend a lot of sessions on the markets, that a lot of these experts go to. Well, these conferences were very, very expensive. I mean, it wasn't just because of travel and you paid like a $500 fee, but the expertise they got there was worth it. I mean, you could afford to spend $8,000, $9,000 on a conference if you expect the knowledge you coming out of that conference you're going to make, $100,000, $200,000 from, right? So even if you hire someone, and you say, well, this person's got plenty of experience and they're working from you. Well, are they going to stay current, on the level, because the markets get more complex, and what influences bond pricing and the timing of bond finances, it has to be current. It can't be based on knowledge that you had 10 years ago. It has to be what's going on in the markets today. And there's a lot of factors and correlations. And so usually that's what a finance advisor is. They're in the markets all the time. They're going to these expensive conferences, so they are aware. So that's why there's it's advantageous to hire a financial advisor. But again, that may not be needed if it's something straightforward. You pretty much know what's going to happen. You may just say, well, let's just go with the underwriter. Because the underwriter, like in a negotiated sale, you're going to negotiate the price up front. So you just may be comfortable with, okay, said he can do it for this much, for this term, and this is how the deal will be structured. I'm happy. And you go for it. Because you're going to have bond counsel to make sure it's legal and stuff like that. So you may just say, I'm happy, and go forward with it. So we talk a little bit about bond ratings in the process. So we talked about the competitive bid process, the negotiated process, and then a part of a debt issuance process is bond rating, going out to obtain bond rating. Municipal bond credit ratings measure the issuer's risk of paying all interest and principal back to investors. A bond rating system helps investors distinguish a company's credit risk. Municipal issuers rely on specialized rating agencies to determine the overall risk of the issue and assign a grade to the bond. The three major rating agencies are Moody's, Investor Services, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch. How many of you have heard of those three? Yeah, about everyone. Ratings have a significant effect on both the ability of the issuer to raise the funds and the price the issuer will be required to pay. So, you've all seen the rating. So the highest rating is AAA, next to that is a AA, then you get above average, which is just an A, and then you get BBB, which is medium. You just cut. Below a BBB, that's considered junk bonds. And it doesn't mean you can't sell a debt issue, it just means you're going to pay a whole lot more for it. So most issuers like to move up the ladder. There is some debate. Oh, I'm being recorded, but I have to say it anyway. I can't help myself. there is some, the idea in the past, people were like, gee, I want to be AAA rated. I want to be AAA rated, But there's some municipalities saying, I think the cost of being AAA rated is not worth it. Now, you got to keep in mind, it doesn't mean that they're saying they don't want to have a good financial management. But remember, this is an outside entity rating you, so it's not necessarily that someone that's familiar with your operations, been around you, and they know what you're doing. They're coming in, so you've got to have all these outside variables that they pay attention to, the ratios they pay attention to and stuff like that, in order that they say, oh, you're AAA rated. And so a lot of times that means soaking aside cash. They want you to have a rainy day fund. They want the rainy day fund to be of a certain amount. They want to see certain amounts in your long-range plan. They want a debt ratio of a certain amount. This is regardless of the situation, because they don't. They say they add most rating agencies say they add a fudge factor to take into account the individual circumstances of your municipalities. But in truth, they're rating a lot of these, so they have their cookie-cutter methodology and their cookie-cutter criteria. And so a lot of people say, if I look at the difference between what the AAA rated entity gets and what the AA rated agency gets in terms of what the market's actually willing to pay, it's not worth it. And especially when you consider the credit market for municipal debt is low. There's not a lot of people going into bankruptcies. It's very few, far and in between. And then even if you do say, well, gee, the market really wants a AAA rated debt issue. Well, you go out, like we talked about earlier, you go out to insurance, bond insurance, and you get your credit enhanced. So you could be a AA rated entity, and you get it enhanced to a AAA. And, of course, you have to pay the insurance premium, but the insurance premium may be cheaper than what it would cost you as an ongoing basis to be a AAA rated entity. I just want to be clear. I'm not saying that people are making a conscious decision to not be the best. They want to be the best. Most people want to have the most state-of-the-art financial management operation as possible. There's no one out there saying, I don't want to have a state-of-the-art financial management operation. What I'm saying is that some entities are saying, it may not be in our financial interest to try to appear to Moody's or Fitch or Standard & Poor's to be AAA. Maybe AA is just good enough for a rating on a debt issue in terms of what we expect to get. So I hope I didn't confuse anybody with that, but I couldn't help myself. So we've issued. What next? The issuer is more than just a participant in the sale of bonds. The agency is the owner of the transaction, the obligor of the debt, until maturity when the debt is fully repaid, perhaps in 20 to 30 years. This means staff must take more than a casual interest in the transaction. While the issuer will hire various finance professionals to assist in the structure of the transaction and the preparation of various legal documents and financial analysis, staff must also have a firm understanding of the commitments made on behalf of their organization. When the transaction closes, the financing team will move on and the public agency will be left with a number of ongoing commitments. If staff cannot explain the structure and obligations of the transaction to their governing board, the deal most likely should not be done. I mean, that happened in Orange County. I mean, you had him going out with these derivative instruments, and the finance director understood them, and nobody else understood them until, they turned bad on him. He was talking about these hedging transactions. I worked for a small government, and we had a utility we owned, a gas and water utility, and one of the things they said was, normally if you stay on the short end of the interest curve, that's the short term. That's the low part of the interest curve. So if you look at the interest curve by year, maturity, you start off a 1-year loan, 2-year, 3-year. So the longer you go out in maturity, the higher the interest rate gets. So if you could stay on the short end of the interest curve, normally, sometimes you get an inverse curve where actually the short-term interest rate is higher than the longer term. But most of the time, the interest rate gets more expensive the longer the debt goes out. So if you can stay on the short end of the interest curve, it's usually good, you save money. But if you're doing a 20-year, 30-year issue, they say, well, that's long-term, unless, of course, you do it variable. And then if you do variable, you get short-term interest rate. But, of course, if rates rise over time, short interest, then that rate may exceed what you would have if you had paid for the long-term rate at the time. So along comes a finance advisor. Actually, back then, I think it was really an underwriter masquerading as a finance advisor. He said, I can give you both. I can give you the protection that you want from a long-term rate, because, you lock in the rate of return for a long time, and the economy of a short-term interest rate. And really how we do it is through forward option commitment. So what happened is you sign the deal today, and it's pretty much like a variable rate. So you're on the short end of the interest curve. And then at any time past 5 years that you elect, you can opt for a fixed term rate, an option contract. So you have the best of both worlds. But how many know that came at a cost? You had to pay for that option contract. But because people were so enamored with the idea, you didn't take a step back and look at it and say, well, look, how much am I saving with the short-term interest rate versus if I paid the fixed-term interest rate over the life of the issue, and add that to the deal that they're proposing and the cost of the forward option contract. And sometimes that price, and if you got an underwriter masquerading as a finance advisor, that the cash flow and the analysis that should be involved, you don't have the in-house expertise, and now you have no one else that's representing your interest that has that expertise. And so the deal gets really tricky. And in that case, your in-house staff are not equipped to handle what happens next. The issuer's typical duties at and after the time of the sale include the approval of a pricing scale. While it may only be, this is what a negotiator said, while it may only be a few basis points, the decision to accept or reject a proposed pricing scale and could mean the difference of hundreds of thousands of dollars in interest expense over the life of the bonds. This is with the negotiated sale. Once the sale is completed and bids accepted, the design staff will sign a bond purchase agreement. Following this, the lawyers will finalize the remaining legal documents, which will be signed a day or two before the actual closing to the transaction. Once the deal closes, staff will need to book the transaction in the general ledger balance, depending on the instruction. And so, it's important internally that your finance people be involved. I mean, your accounting people, the bean counters, are involved with the structure of the transaction so that they properly record it. There was a problem in Florida with continuing disclosures and what they were doing with the capital projects. Now, you didn't necessarily have to assume that they were trying to intentionally do something to hide stuff from investors, but it could have been that the accounting people didn't understand the nature of the transaction, and the way they accounted for it became to be misleading to the outside investors. So so it's important that they're involved at some point in the process, that they understand the nature of the transaction so that they can properly account for it. In addition, setting up a tickler file with key dates of when bond payments are due and when continuing disclosure information needs to be filed is extremely useful. During the period when there are unspent bond proceeds or reserve funds, staff will want to determine how these funds should be invested. This may be with the help of a third party. So if you don't do like a bond anticipation note where you spend some money first and then you issue bonds to repay yourself, then what's likely is going to happen, you go out with a bond issue, now you've got this huge cash infusion, so it's sitting in the bank, and you should invest it. You shouldn't just sit on it. But once you invest it, you have to make sure there's tax rules around it, especially if it's a tax-exempt debt. So once you invest it, normally that if the return on the investments exceeds the true interest cost of the debt, that's what is known as positive arbitrage. And positive arbitrage, has certain tax laws associated with it. Because the government doesn't want municipalities going out there and speculating and saying, well, look, I can issue at the tax-exempt rate, but I can invest at the taxable rate, and so I can make this margin. So they tend to have this, what they call positive arbitrage. Now, to avoid positive arbitrage, obviously you could do things like buy a government investment contract. A guaranteed investment contract. And those are contracts, security instruments specifically sold that are exempt. IRS exempts them, so whatever you make on a GIC is not subject to arbitrage. But the other thing is that it's a spend out. If you spend it within, the IRS has various spend out exceptions. So as long as you spend it within those periods, 18 months, 24 months, and in some instances up to 36 months, your bond counsel will make you aware of it, then you're fine. So there's clearly that you're not doing it for speculation. You clearly need it for construction projects, and as long as you spend it along those timelines, the proceeds that is, then you're fine from those analyses. But you still either in-house or you hire an outside entity to do periodic calculations to make sure you're not in an arbitrage situation. Now, luckily, lately, that has not been a concern of most governments because we haven't been making much interest, where you invest it. Just the rate environment, so that's just really not been a concern. But if things are starting to pick up and Federal Reserve is signaling that they should raise rates, so it still will become a concern again. So, and that's important to you as an official because it's what your finance people must do. But if you don't do that, and including your proper continuing disclosure, which the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board has made easy by a website that's nicknamed EMMA. Please don't ask me to spell out the acronym, what EMMA means. It's in my notes somewhere, but it's EMMA. Everyone refers to it as EMMA. If you did a Google search for EMMA, it would come up, EMMA, it would come up. And you just upload like your CAFR, your Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, and some other stuff that may be in your official statement that you agree to inform investors on, and then you should be fine. We talked a little about, that's EMMA, that's the site I just told you about, Electronic Municipal Market Access. Tax compliant, to assist the, To assist the issue with tax compliance, the National Association of Bond Lawyers and the Government Finance Office Association have jointly developed a checklist to assist bond counsel in discussion with issuers and conduit borrowers as applicable post-issuance compliance matters. The checklist is divided into 3 parts: tax, securities, and state law matters. The checklist can serve as a framework for discussion at an appropriate time during the transaction or as a written document prepared by bond counsel and furnished to the issuer or conduit borrower after completion of the financing. Bond counsel may need to explain various items on the checklist to provide the issuer with a more complete understanding of the noted concept. The checklist can be amended or supplemented as needed to address a particular financing issue. For instance, how many of you did Build America bonds? So if you did any of those qualified energy control bonds, so if you did any of those types of bonds where the government agrees to subsidize the interest payment, there's additional things that probably you need on this checklist that you have to do. You know, you have to file initial filing with the IRS, and then you have to, there's certain times when you apply for the subsidy, and if you don't meet those times, you don't get your subsidy. So if you price the issue dependent on the subsidies, you have to make sure that you're following those. So in your checklist, those are some of the unique things they're talking about. So you got the cookie cutter checklist, and then you probably need a customized checklist depending on what type of issue you did. Issuers and conduit borrowers are encouraged to contact bond counsel at any time they may have questions or concerns pertaining to tax, securities, or state law issues. It is important to remember the goal of establishing and following written procedures is to identify and resolve noncompliance on a timely basis to preserve the preferential status of tax-advantaged bonds. So the last thing you don't want to have happen is you make a tax-exempt issue and it's subsequently determined not to be tax-exempt because you're not meeting your continuing disclosure requirements. And you keep in mind that part of your continuing disclosure requirements include any covenants you make in the debt sheet. Like if in the case of pledged revenues, you agree to have a certain leverage coverage ratio, you agree to maintain a certain fund balance. So those type of things have to be disclosed on an annual basis to let investors know you're continuing to meet those debt covenants. Did I go the wrong way? Yeah, I went the wrong way. So we're at the stage of questions. I know you've been asking some questions. Is there any other questions out there? I guess we got a few minutes. I'll question out. Okay.
In our state, there's a state bond advisor that is supposed to be for the state entity, any kind of issue. He's wanting to get involved into our local issues, and of course the outside bond councils, they're kind of fighting it and everything. What, in your experience and everything, on the structure of the team, because there's a number of teams, and most people in the public doesn't realize, they just see all these attorneys listed and they're getting a piece of the pie and it's cost them money. From what do you see, how do you justify to the public the team that you have to have, the bond counsel, whether it's a flat fee or it's a percentage of the issuance? How have you seen it in your practice?
Could you start with the first part? What was I didn't get the first part of the question.
Oh, well, I was just clarifying. We have a state bond advisor that is under
state bond advisor.
Yeah,
okay.
we have a state bond advisor, and he's putting pressure on the state legislature that they want all bond issues from local and school districts, local governments and school districts, go through the state bond advisor.
Oh, really? What's the role of the bond advisor in your state?
The role of the state bond advisor, from what I see, is just whatever any issues that the state does, and then also he wants to oversee all. He wants to oversee all the bond issues, but they want it all go through the state bond advisor to be approved.
Yeah, I think that's kind of strange. You know, one of the things that we mentioned this earlier, that you have bond counsel for is that, and you choose a bond counsel firm really for their expertise, and not just their expertise of federal law, but also in state and local law. So in terms from a legal perspective, your bond counsel that you employ is really going to counsel you in regards to, is this in compliance with state law? in terms of whether or not this particular debt issue is in your best interest, obviously you're in the better position to know that. I mean, and then if you have a financial advisor, then obviously, the two of them. So I don't know, if the bond advisor somehow has some, like he can bring additional resources to bear in terms of, gee, if I'm involved, there may be some state money we can bring into this, especially in the case of schools, so it may save you on borrowing costs or something like that. But just to get additional advice, I'm not sure. I don't see where it's needed. Unless they're saying we're going to pay for bond counsel and it'll save you money.
That's where they want to say that they'll save us money on the issuance if we're not paying a flat fee or a commission, basically, or a percentage off the issuance debt.
Yeah, I can see where that could save you money. It just depends on the scope of what advice they'll give you, because a lot of times with bond counsel, you need them for the particular issue, but you're going to need them outside of that particular issue as well. I mean, you develop these relationships, questions come up, you can call bond counsel and, they give you advice on it. So it depends on if the state is just saying for that particular issue and then after that don't call me, or if they're saying, no, we'll be just as open as a bond counsel that you hire.
Just curious if does anybody pay flat fees where they get, or is it always a percentage of the issuance?
Which one's more popular? That's a good question. Like we retain our bond, when I say we, I'm talking about Montgomery County. We sort of retain our bond counsel year round. So, but we do have an hourly rate. But it's based on the fact that we're not just paying them for a particular issue, so we're paying them, year round. Sometimes we'll bring another bond counsel depending on the nature of the structure of the deal. But that's an interesting question, whether you want to play a flat rate or I think it depends on how often you use them.
Some entities use multiple financial advisors throughout the year for different issuances. How important would you say, or how valuable would it be to just have one FA that kind of covers all of your credits and your entity? Or do you think there's value in having an FA that may be more well-known with a certain type of credit for one transaction and then get another FA, for another type of transaction? Or should you just have one FA?
That's a good question, because, the advantage of having one FA obviously is that he's familiar with your government. He's familiar, the more they work with you, the more they're familiar with your government, the nature of your finance operations. But as you indicated, the disadvantage is they may not be have the most knowledge on a particular type of debt or what the market's doing related to a particular structure of debt. So it really depends on your comfortability with the firm and the diversity of which you feel the firm, like, let's say like a firm like PFM, can they handle the range of issues and you get top level advice? Even if the firm has a good reputation, they may not be for certain issues. There may be firms out there that just do a better job at it. They can do a better, because they develop an expertise on. I don't think I would feel comfortable just saying to myself, even if I tend to use the same financial advisor a lot, like we go out with an RFP and then we award it, and then that becomes our main financial advisor, but we still, depending on particular circumstances, we'll bring in another finance advisor. You just always want to leave that option open to you. There's one thing I just wanted to alert you to, that GFOA has come out with another best practice. So you can go on GFOA's website and they have a number of best practices as it relates to debt. But one that they just recently came out with had to do with pension obligation bonds. They at one point were very popular. So your pension fund is unfunded and you're looking at this huge unfunded obligation. And what a lot of governments were being convinced of is that they can go out and issue these, what they call pension obligation bonds. And they were told that the interests that were earned through investments of the proceeds from the bond would exceed the interest on the bonds. And therefore they would be the better for it, because you can take this pension obligation bond, help offset your unfunded liability, and the interest that you make on those bonds would exceed the return on the interest on the bond, and so it's like, hey, it's all gravy. The problem is, and it's mentioned on the website, if you go there, the problem is that a lot of times it didn't turn out that way. I mean, you didn't have such a huge differential between what you invested at and what you were having to pay interest on. So those are some of the things that by having, like we said earlier, we have 19,000 members, and that means you got members that have tried stuff and got burned, and then we share that collective wisdom. And partnership, that's part of, I'm not on that slide. Part of why there's a good partnership between GFOA and NACo is NACo has thousands of members as well, a lot of elected officials, and the synergy between the two, the knowledge that is shared, results in, you go onto the various websites and you find the best practices to avoid. One final thing I wanted to say before we close out, if there's no more questions, and that, how many of you heard of premiums? We sold this bond issue at a premium. I've been almost 30 years working in public finance, and it always amazes me how people treat premiums when they get them. It's like they think it's a windfall. We issued debt at a premium, free money. But, when you consider why you're getting a premium, so you're getting a premium because the rate you have on your coupons that you marketed your bond at is higher than what the market expects. And so what they're doing is they're giving you more than the first face value of the bond to buy down the interest rate. So if investors think, hey, this debt really should be issued at a 3% rate, and you've got on your coupon rate 5%, they're going to give you extra money to buy down the rate. But keep in mind that up front you're getting this windfall, this premium. But over the life of the bond, what interest rate are you going to be paying? You're going to be paying that 5% rate when you could have issued at a 3% rate. So it's not free money. It's just that when you went out and you priced your debt issue, you didn't get it quite right. And that can happen. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. But if it's sort of looked at, if the premium is sort of looked at as a windfall, then the problem is, then the finance team feels the pressure that, we got to get this windfall every time. We get the kudos, but that's just raising your long-term debt service costs. Is that clear? It's just going to end up increasing your debt service costs. So you really want to try to get it right, as best you can. I know when I was in Cook County, Illinois, I'm not saying that Cook County did a lot of things right, but one of the things, in addition to a finance advisor, we hired a pricing agent. And the purpose of the pricing agent was to give us further advice on how the bond should be priced. And that's all this pricing agent did. He had huge models of data across. He worked out in New York. And that's what he advised us on, solely on the price, what we should price the debt issue at. Well, thanks a lot. I've had fun. I know we finished early. You said I could finish a little early, right?